a lot of what Wickham says we can confirm. He mentions that the world is blinded by his fortune and consequence, and we do know that Mr. Darcy is very wealthy and has a very high social standing. Or frightened by his high and imposing manners and sees him only as he chooses to be seen. And we do know that Darcy is intimidating. He is very formal. He does stick to a lot of rules and beliefs of the time. So that all certainly seems to make sense. He also doesn't automatically agree with what Elizabeth says. He's kind of hesitant to offer criticism, although he doesn't say, no, Darcy has a good temper. So that's telling. Mr. Wickham began to speak on more general topics, Meryton, the neighborhood, the society, appearing highly pleased with all that he had yet seen, and speaking of the latter, especially, with gentle but very intelligible gallantry. It was the prospect of constant society and good society, he added, which was my chief inducement to enter the shire. I know it to be a most respectable, agreeable corps, and my friend Denny tempted me further by his account of their present quarters, and the very great attentions and excellent acquaintance Meryton had procured them. Society, I own, is necessary to me. I have been a disappointed man, and my spirits will not bear solitude. I must have employment in society. A military life is not what I was intended for, but circumstances have now made it eligible. The church ought to have been my profession. I was brought up for the church, and I should at this time have been in possession of a most valuable living, had it pleased the gentleman we were speaking of just now. Indeed. So when he says a valuable living, what he means by that is he says he was meant to be part of the clergy, like Mr. Collins. He was going to go into the church, and he was supposed to have a living, which would have been a parish to oversee and preach at, and also would have entailed a house that he could live in, a place that he could stay. But he was prevented from having that by Mr. Darcy. Yes, the late Mr. Darcy bequeathed me the next presentation of the best living in his gift. He was my godfather and excessively attached to me. I cannot do justice to his kindness. He meant to provide for me amply, and thought he had done it, but when the living fell, it was given elsewhere. Good heavens, cried Elizabeth, but how could that be? How could his will be disregarded? Why did you not seek legal redress? And so Mr. Darcy Sr. Promised Wickham that he could have one of those parish positions and places to live. Mr. Darcy Sr. was Wickham's godfather, so someone who was supposed to offer spiritual guidance, but oftentimes also help their godchild. And he meant to provide for him amply, so he meant to make sure that he had a way to support himself in the world. But when the living fell, so when this position in this house opened up, it went to someone else. So Elizabeth very understandably asks, how is that possible if it was arranged legally? Why didn't you go to a lawyer and, figure this out? It seems totally unjust. There was just such an informality in the terms of the bequest as to give me no hope from law. A man of honor could not have doubted the intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it, or to treat it as a merely conditional recommendation, and to assert that I had forfeited all claim to it by extravagance, imprudence, in short, anything or nothing. So now he's talking about Mr. Darcy, our Mr. Darcy, and says he didn't take this as a legally binding agreement. He said it was just a conditional recommendation, so that he had to meet certain conditions to have this. And basically Mr. Darcy just said, Mr. Darcy said, you can't have this position in this profession. Certain it is that the living became vacant 2 years ago, exactly as I was of an age to hold it, and that it was given to another man, and no less certain is it that I cannot accuse myself of having really done anything to deserve to lose it. I have a warm, unguarded temper, and I may perhaps have sometimes spoken of my opinion of him and to him too freely. I can recall nothing worse, but the fact is that we are very different sort of men, and that he hates me. So the only thing that Wickham can think of that may have made our Mr. Darcy behave in this way is that Mr. Wickham has a temper and may have said things about him or to him that were not the greatest, and that's the only thing that he can think of that would lead to him not getting this position, not getting this house. This is quite shocking. He deserves to be publicly disgraced. Sometime or other he will be, but it shall not be by me. Till I can forget his father, I can never defy or expose him." Elizabeth honored him for such feelings, and thought him handsomer than ever as he expressed them. "But what," said she, after a pause, "can have been his motive? What can have induced him to behave so cruelly?" "A thorough, determined dislike of me, a dislike which I cannot but attribute in some measure to jealousy. Had the late Mr. Darcy liked me less, his son might have borne with me better. But his father's uncommon attachment to me irritated him, I believe, very early in life. He had not a temper to bear the sort of competition in which we stood, the sort of preference which was often given me." So Wickham says that Mr. Darcy really dislikes him. It was most likely due to jealousy because Mr. Darcy's father really did like and bond with Wickham, and that there is a sort of competitive edge to their growing up together, and that was really what led to this situation. "I had not thought Mr. Darcy so bad as this, though I have never liked him. I had not thought so very ill of him. I had supposed him to be despising his fellow creatures in general, but did not suspect him of descending to such malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this." After a few minutes' reflection, however, she continued, "I do remember him boasting one day at Netherfield of the implacability of his resentments, of his having an unforgiving temper. His disposition must be dreadful." And that's also true. It's one of the faults that Mr. Darcy admits while they're staying at Netherfield. He says, my good opinion once lost is lost forever. So it seems that Wickham has lost his good opinion, if he ever had a good opinion of Wickham. "I will not trust myself on the subject," replied Wickham. "I can hardly be just to him." Elizabeth was again deep in thought, and after a time exclaimed, "To treat in such a manner the godson, the friend, the favourite of his father!" She could have added, "A young man too like you, whose very countenance may vouch for you being amiable." But she contented herself with, "And one too, who had probably been his own companion from childhood, connected together, as I think you said, in the closest manner." So, Elizabeth is pretty shocked by this because that's a very deep level of resentment and bitterness going on, that Mr. Darcy would willingly take something away from someone his father really cared about. And she even kind of mentions, she thinks about saying but doesn't really say, "Oh, and someone like you who's really handsome and who is so good looking and kind and friendly, that just all of that could vouch for and prove that you're a good person." She doesn't say that, of course. She's just adds that she's surprised because Darcy and Wickham must have grown up together. "We were born in the same parish within the same park. The greatest part of our youth was passed together, inmates of the same house, sharing the same amusements, objects of the same parental care. My father began life in the profession which your uncle, Mr. Phillips, appears to do so much credit to, but he gave up everything to be of use to the late Mr. Darcy, and devoted all his time to the care of the Pemberley property. He was most highly esteemed by Mr. Darcy, a most intimate, confidential friend. Mr. Darcy often acknowledged himself to be under the greatest obligations to my father's active superintendence, and when, immediately before my father's death, Mr. Darcy gave him a voluntary promise of providing for me, I am convinced that he felt it to be as much a debt of gratitude to him as of affection to myself." So Wickham's father, Wickham Sr., was very good friends with Mr. Darcy Sr., and he even helped manage Mr. Darcy's estate, took care of business and property matters for him. So that's part of the reason why Mr. Darcy Sr. is our Wickham's godfather. Mr. Darcy Sr. also felt that he was indebted to Wickham's father, so that's in part why he promised Wickham that he would have a place in this church position in this church house. So he's saying that it was sort of a two reasons for Mr. Darcy Sr. to help him, that he cared about his father and that he cared about Wickham. "How strange," cried Elizabeth, "how abominable! I wonder that the very pride of this Mr. Darcy has not made him just to you, if from no better motive, that he should not have been too proud to be dishonest, for dishonesty I must call it." "It is wonderful," replied Wickham, "for almost all his actions may be traced to pride, and pride has often been his best friend. It has connected him nearer with virtue than any other feeling. But we are none of us consistent, and in his behavior to me there were stronger impulses even than pride. So Elizabeth says, wouldn't someone as proud as Mr. Darcy, do an honest thing and give you what you're properly owed? And Wickham says, yes, he is very proud, and his pride is probably the thing that makes him, a decent person. It brings him closest to virtue, but this is an inconsistency in his character. Can such abominable pride as his have ever done him good? Yes, it has often led him to be liberal and generous, to give his money freely, to display hospitality, to assist his tenants and relieve the poor. Family pride and filial pride, for he is very proud of what his father was, have done this. Not to appear to disgrace his family, to degenerate from the popular qualities, or lose the influence of the Pemberley house, is a powerful motive. He also has brotherly pride, which, with some brotherly affection, makes him a very kind and careful guardian of his sister, and you will hear him generally cried up as the most attentive and best of brothers. So even though Wickham does really dislike Mr. Darcy, he will admit some of his good points. He says that pride makes him behave in good and generous ways. He helps the poor. He can be kind because of his pride. He's has a lot of family pride, cared about his father a great deal, and also about his sister, even though that may make him protective of his sister. What sort of a girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head. I wish I could call her amiable. It gives me pain to speak ill of a Darcy, but she is too much like her brother, very, very proud. As a child, she was affectionate and pleasing and extremely fond of me, and I have devoted hours and hours to her amusement. But she is nothing to me now. She is a handsome girl, about 15 or 16, and I understand highly accomplished. Since her father's death, her home has been in London, where a lady lives with her and superintends her education. That's also consistent with what Darcy said. He mentions that his sister is very accomplished and meets all of his ridiculous requirements for what an accomplished lady should be. So Wickham is also in agreement with him on that. After many pauses and many trials of other subjects, Elizabeth could not help reverting once more to the first and saying, I am astonished at his intimacy with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who seems good humor itself, and is, I really believe, truly amiable, be in friendship with such a man? How can they suit each other? Do you know Mr. Bingley? Not at all. He is a sweet-tempered, amiable, charming man. He cannot know what Mr. Darcy is. Probably not, but Mr. Darcy can please where he chooses. He does not want abilities. He can be a conversible companion if he thinks it worth his while. Among those who are at all his equals in consequence, he is a very different man from what he is to the less prosperous. His pride never deserts him, but with the rich he is liberal-minded, just, sincere, rational, honorable, and perhaps agreeable, allowing something for fortune and figure. Wickham basically says here that Darcy is only friends with the wealthy and people who are of the same social class as him. Anyone who he considers beneath him, he will not waste those same good manners on. The whist party soon afterwards breaking up, the players gathered round the other table, and Mr. Collins took a station between his cousin Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. The usual inquiries as to his success were made by the latter. It had not been very great. He had lost every point. But when Mrs. Phillips began to express her concern thereupon, he assured her with much earnest gravity that it was not of the least importance, that he considered the money as a mere trifle, and begged she would not make herself uneasy. I know very well, madam, said he, that when persons sit down to a card table, they must take their chance of these things, and happily I am not in such circumstances as to make 5 shillings any object. There are undoubtedly many who could not say the same, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, I am removed far beyond the necessity of regarding little matters. Mr. Wickham's attention was caught, and after observing Mr. Collins for a few moments, he asked Elizabeth in a low voice whether her relation were very intimately acquainted with the family of de Bourgh. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she replied, has very lately given him a living. I hardly know how Mr. Collins was first introduced to her notice, but he certainly has not known her long. You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters, consequently that she is aunt to the present Mr. Darcy. So this happens quite often in Regency era literature, and especially in Victorian literature. They had this idea about providence and the guiding hand of God, that oftentimes people were connected in surprising ways. So this is one of those examples. Mr. Wickham says that Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is Mr. Collins' patroness, she is sisters with Mr. Darcy's deceased mother. So Lady Catherine de Bourgh is actually Mr. Darcy's aunt. No, indeed, I did not. I knew nothing at all of Lady Catherine's connections. I never heard of her existence till the day before yesterday. Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and it is believed that she and her cousin will unite the two estates. This information made Elizabeth smile, as she thought of poor Miss Bingley. Vain indeed must be all her attentions, vain and useless her affection for his sister, and her praise of himself, if he were already self-destined to another. So Wickham is saying that Mr. Darcy is supposed to marry Lady Catherine de Bourgh's daughter, and Elizabeth kind of laughs to herself and thinks, Caroline Bingley is doing all of this to try and impress him and win him over, and he may already be set up with someone else. Yes, they are first cousins, Miss de Bourgh and Mr. Darcy. Mr. Collins, said she, speaks highly of both Lady Catherine and her daughter, but from some particulars that he has related of her ladyship, I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and that, in spite of her being his patroness, she is an arrogant, conceited woman. I believe her to be both in a great degree, replied Wickham. I have not seen her for many years, but I very well remember that I never liked her, and that her manners were dictatorial and insolent. She has a reputation of being remarkably sensible and clever, but I rather believe she derives part of her abilities from her rank and fortune, part from her authoritative manner, and the rest from the pride of her nephew, who chooses that everyone connected with him should have an understanding of the first class. So according to Wickham, Lady Catherine de Bourgh is very snobbish and stuck up. She thinks herself very clever and important, but part of that may just sort of be bluster and her building herself up. Elizabeth allowed that he had given a very rational account of it, and they continued talking together with mutual satisfaction till supper put an end to cards, and gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mr. Wickham's attentions. There could be no conversation in the noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party, but his manners recommended him to everybody. Whatever he said was said well, and whatever he did, done gracefully. Elizabeth went away with her head full of him. She could think of nothing but Mr. Wickham, and of what he had told her all the way home. But there was not time for her even to mention his name as they went, for neither Lydia nor Mr. Collins were one silent. Lydia talked incessantly of lottery tickets, of the fish she had lost and the fish she had won, and Mr. Collins, in describing the civility of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, protesting that he did not in the least regard his losses at whist, enumerating all the dishes at supper, and repeatedly fearing that he had crowded his cousins, had more to say than he could well manage before the carriage stopped at Longbourn House. So Elizabeth is still thinking about Wickham, daydreaming about Wickham, and the whole carriage ride home. Lydia won't stop talking about the card games, and Mr. Collins won't stop talking and saying how great everything was. And that is chapter 16. One thing to note, too, we haven't met Georgiana Darcy. We just have heard about her from Mr. Darcy, from Caroline, and from Wickham now. So we know that she's supposed to be a very accomplished lady from Mr. Darcy and Caroline's conversation, and now Mr. Wickham is adding to that she's 15 or 16, and she seems to be, like her brother, very proud.